I'll be really honest, this next story, it does sound like something that you would expect as a storyline perhaps on Call the Midwife. As many as 250,000 women, they are thought to have been made to give up their babies for adoption in the 1950s, 60s and 70s because they weren't married. Some of those babies who were adopted and are now adults, they are calling for an official apology from the government for the way that their mums were treated. We know last year there was a parliamentary committee report into this, the Joint Committee on Human Rights, or the JCHR, which the government responded to earlier on this month. We talk about that and plenty more. This was my conversation with Vik Fielder. Now, Vicky is from Overstowe, near Bridgewater, and was adopted in the early 70s.
Well, I was born in London in 1971. I was born in Enfield. I stayed with my mother in the hospital for 7 days. And then I was adopted and brought to Somerset.
Right, 7 days.
Yes.
You were with your birth mother.
Yes.
When did you first know what happened to her and why?
Growing up, I always knew of her. Mm-hmm. I knew what her name was. My parents didn't keep anything from us. Any information they had, they shared with us.
Your adoptive parents,
yes, yeah. So I had as much information as they had, which was quite scant. We didn't get very many details. I sort of went through my childhood without really thinking about it. We're fed a line of your mother couldn't look after you. She did what was best for you. You're not given that opportunity to really grieve when you should. Do you know what I mean? Because it's a huge loss for a child to lose their mother, even if they're a baby. I think like a lot of adoptees, it really came to the fore when I had children. And when I had my daughter, when she was 7 days old, which was, the age that I was relinquished at, that it really hit me hard. It was the first time I'd ever met somebody that I was biologically related to when I gave birth to her. And so then I started thinking about my birth mother, going about how I would search for her.
Mm. There was never that conversation to be had of, hang on a second, am I adopted? Because you, a biracial child put with a white family.
Yeah.
So it was always clear from the start, wasn't it?
Yeah. No, I mean, we were never lied to or anything like that. Difficult to disguise.
Talk to me about your childhood then and what that was like at that time growing up in Somerset.
It wasn't pleasant. There was a lot of racism. It was difficult to deal with because there's no black community in Taunton, so that wasn't like I had anybody that I could go to and say this is happening, or they're saying these things, and have someone that sort of had been there and was in your corner. It was very difficult. School particularly, I really did not enjoy going to school at all.
What would they do?
I've got beaten up, I got name called. I mean, my first day in my secondary school, I got laid out with the epitaph, that's for being a racial epithet.
To experience that at school, what were you then like when you went home?
That was horrible. I took out my frustrations on my sister. But I think by the time I'd got to about 13, it was acknowledged that this really was an issue. And my parents tried to get me in therapy and things like that to try and work out. But the whole time, it was more emphasis on the race and the bullying without talking about the adoption, which was actually the elephant in the room.
And was that what you wanted to talk about? You didn't want to discuss it?
No. I've only been able to talk about it in the last few years. I've been quite a closed book. It's a hard thing to talk about because it makes me sad, but the prevailing narrative is that I should be happy and grateful and glad that I was adopted, but that's not how I feel.
For you, I mean, as you approach 16, 18, you're thinking about your future, what you want to do with your life. But what were your plans?
I ran away to the army.
Right, why?
I wanted to get out of Taunton.
And how was that?
It was good fun, but I should never have joined the army. It wasn't, I'm not very disciplined when it comes to things like that. I found myself in an enormous amount of trouble quite a lot of the time. I think it was a welcome relief for both me and the army when I left. I can't maintain a relationship. I've been on my own for 20 years. I've raised my children on my own. It's difficult to form attachments to people when the one person that should love you most in the world gives you away.
When did you start finding out more about her and how did you do that, your birth mother?
Well, in 1995, actually, before my children or anything like that, the government announced that you could access your records. So I did that in 1995. I didn't find out very much about my birth mother that I didn't already know, but I did get a name for my birth father, which I hadn't had up until that point, and a little bit of information about him. And I kind of filed that and put it away and didn't think about it again. And then years later, after my son was born, so this would be 2003, 2004, I was tinkering around on the internet. And before Facebook, there was Friends Reunited.
Yeah.
And then there was a pop-up for Genes Reunited that came up. And I thought, oh, and I'd been putting my birth mother's name into the internet for years and not getting anything. And that's as far as I'd actively gone searching. So I put her name into that and I got 2 hits. So I reached out very diplomatically to both of the people that I'd had hits from. And one of them came straight back to me and said, I know exactly who you are. Can I phone you? So I was like, yeah, okay. And then she phoned me and she told me that unfortunately my mother had passed away in 1992.
I'm so sorry.
She was only 38. And it was directly because of having to give me up. She just couldn't.
How do you even begin to process that?
You can't. Because you always, as a kid, you think, I'm going to meet her. When I was looking for her, I was thinking, she's only going to be 50. Do you know what I mean? It's going to be really easy. To find out that she was dead, just... I can't talk about that one.
That's, of course.
I mean, I got some answers. She was one of 9. And then found out some other stuff about her family upbringing and things, but she had a hard life. Do you know what I mean? And then to be told that you can't bring your baby home and that you have to give your baby away before you're allowed to come home. I mean, that's just a horrible thing to do to her. She was 18 years old. As far as I'm concerned, she was a child. And the prevailing societal pressures of the time meant that these women weren't given an opportunity to raise their children. And we weren't given an opportunity to be raised by our mothers.
There will be people listening out there who were given up for adoption and it's because their parents or the mother, they said, no, I can't do this, I don't want you. When that decision is forced upon you and you found that out, did that change anything?
It was heartbreaking to read about her and to read. She waited for as long as she possibly could. She was trying to find ways out of it. She was trying to find ways that she could. In the letter from the social worker where she's talking about the relinquishment, it talks about her grief and her sorrow. And that's hard to read, to know that as a society, hundreds of thousands of women were put through this process. And the scars that it's left on both the women and the children, because people thought of us as blank slates. They thought of 7-day-old baby. There's no trauma with that. Off they go and they can start afresh and it will be. But no, if you take a child away from its mother so early, it's gonna feel to the child like a life-threatening event, because your mother is your life. And you talk about the first 6 months of life as being the 4th trimester, because children need to be. You know, we don't take kittens or dogs away and puppies away from their mothers at 7 days because we know they wouldn't thrive. But we'll take children away.
What do you want to hear from the government?
I want to hear them say sorry. I want to hear them acknowledge that they had a part in this process. They wrote the laws, they funded the adoption agencies, they funded the mother and baby homes. In their response to the recent JCHR report, they said sorry. I don't know how many times. I think we counted 20 times. But at the end said they didn't feel that there was state involvement in adoption, so there's no requirement for the government to apologise. But you only have to scratch the surface and see that the NHS was involved, social workers were involved, the funding came from central government to fund the mother and baby homes. So how the state can say that they're not involved and they don't need to give an apology really boggles my mind. I mean, there's lots of things that we would like to change. For example, when a child gets adopted, their medical records are sealed and a new NHS number is generated and their medical records start from scratch. So any information held in their previous medical records is sealed. And I can't see what was in my medical records before I was adopted easily.
And have you found that, that obviously becomes a problem if doctors ask you about...
Well, I have MS, and it probably took about 18 months longer to diagnose it because I didn't have medical history. And in the end, I took a DNA test to find my paternal side of the family so that I could get medical history.
Right. Talk to me more about your birth father and the fact that in finding him, has connected you to, am I right in saying, sort of half siblings?
Yeah. When I say my parents shared as much information as they had, I'm pretty sure that in my paperwork it said that my father was already married and he had a young son.
Your birth father?
My birth father.
Yeah.
So there was a little bit of me that always knew I had a bigger brother. So I took this DNA test and the results came back and the very top match was for a half sister, which I was looking for a brother. So I reached out to her. I don't know what I was thinking really, because I just sent her a message saying, I think I'm your sister, without any really thought about how that would impact her. But it turns out, yeah, we're half sisters. We share a father. She's a couple of years older than me. So I've never had a big sister. I've always been the oldest, so it's lovely. And she lives in Bristol.
No.
Yeah, she's always lived in Bristol. And there's probably a good chance that when I've gone up to Bristol shopping, she's been out in Broadmead and we've crossed paths or something. Like, we've talked about it.
Because your birth father's from Jamaica.
Yeah, but he was living in London and the UK at the time. Yeah, and she wasn't adopted, but she didn't grow up within our father's family either. She stayed with her mother and then her mother remarried. So she didn't have any idea about any of us. So I made contact with her, and then I made contact with a cousin who, interestingly enough, has MS. So I got an answer very quickly for that question. And she told me I have two brothers, an older brother and a younger brother. So the next couple of weeks was a little bit of a whirlwind. Oh, and my birth father was still alive and living in Jamaica, but he was really quite poorly by then. So I wrote him a letter, and then the rest of us were WhatsApping and messaging non-stop for about what it felt like a month. And then I went up and saw my sister in Bristol, which was amazing because we look alike.
Just go more into that emotional side of being in the same room as somebody that you share blood with.
She's lovely, and we think the same. Do you know what I mean? It's been so easy getting to know my brothers and sister because we think the same. My brothers came down, we met at St Audrey's. We hired a couple of vans. When I saw my brothers walking towards me, my younger brother walks like me, he looks like me. You know, it was really quite surreal, but tinged with so much sadness because it's 50 years that we've missed out on, 50 years that our kids could have grown up together. But I've met a lot of cousins as well. I've got some lovely cousins, and they all came down for my 50th birthday. Drove down from the big smoke, because most of them are in London, to this tiny little village to sit in a field with me for my 50th, which I thought was quite lovely.
And have they, I'm guessing as well, have they been able to, I don't want to say teach you, but can tell you more about your heritage?
Oh yeah, I mean, my sister cooks for me every time I go out. I'm trying to get better with spicy food.
Yeah.
I'm not brilliant. I grew up on spaghetti bolognese.
So what, do you bring certain things to her? And...
So this time I went up last weekend and I took her a fruit crumble, and then, but normally I'll come back with some jerk chicken and all of that. And yeah, it's lovely. She's really been teaching me a little bit about the food. That's where we come together, because I like food.
What does the word family mean to you?
I don't think it's a traditional construct for me. It's too nuanced. I consider my family to be me and my kids. That's our unit. That's our family unit. Everybody else is extended family, even brothers and sisters. Do you know what I mean? If you ask me about my family, I'm going to talk to you about my children.
And how are they?
They're brilliant. My daughter's at university. She's at Bath Spa. And my son's at Bridgewater College. They're lovely children. You know, I went from being the eldest child of 4 to the middle child of 7.
So that's the eldest child of 4 being
me and
your adopted family.
Yeah. Our setup is I was adopted first, and then my parents had a daughter almost exactly a year after my birthday. And then they wanted to adopt a boy. So they adopted my brother, and then they had my sister subsequently. So there was 4 of us, and there's only 6 years between us. So we were quite a tight little family growing up. But I was the eldest, and that was the role that I sort of knew. And then I've gone from that to having an older brother and an older sister, so really the middle child. And I keep saying to my friends, does that mean I can just do what I want now because I'm the middle child? My brothers and sisters I grew up with, we share experience but not biology. And then my brothers and sisters I didn't grow up with, we share biology but not experience.
Wow, yeah.
So it's juggling all of those.
Obviously, we've talked a lot about what has happened, the past. How do you view the future?
There's a few things that I'd like to see changed for adult adoptees. That I'm not just talking about the forced adoptions, the 1949 to 1976, which is contained within the JCHR report. I like to look at it as all adoptees. So young children that are in the system at the moment, we'd like to make changes that will affect all of them and all of us. And there's a couple of really quick wins for the government. We'd like to see a tick box on medical records, because currently adoptees are treated as having no family medical history. So if I go and have my mammogram and they say, have you got any family history? And I say I'm adopted, they take it that I have no family history. So if I have got a family history of breast cancer and I don't know it, I'm just carrying that around like a little time bomb. A tick box so that people can identify us as adoptees would, number one, it would mean that researchers could gather data. At the moment, there's no data out there reflecting outcomes for adoptees, not decent amount of data. It also means that people within the medical profession could work a bit more sensitively with adoptees. For example, midwives. When I had my daughter, I don't think the midwife understood the complete profoundness of an adoptee having their first child. And they sort of wheeled in and said, well, take the baby off to the nursery for a few hours. And I'm like, no, you're not. You absolutely are not. That baby is staying right next to me the whole time.
What was your mum's name?
Gillian. But everybody called her Jenny Wren. So when I talk to her family, they don't know who I'm talking about half the time. When I say Gillian, they're like, oh, Jen. Yeah, Jen. But on my paperwork, she's Gillian, so she'll always be Gillian to me.
I really want to thank Vik Fielder there from Overstowey, near Bridgewater, who was adopted in the early 70s, for talking, about her story at length, and I really appreciate that. We invited the government to respond to Vicky's interview. They sent a statement, and it says, the government agrees with the Joint Committee on Human Rights findings that the treatment during this period of many unmarried parents, especially women, was wrong and should not have happened. The adoption practices of this time caused suffering to many women and their children and had a profound impact on the family lives of all of those involved. We're sorry to all of those affected by historic adoption practices. We are sorry on behalf of society for what happened. Whilst we cannot undo the past, lessons of the time have been learned and have led to significant changes to legislation and practice. It's 8:20.